Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was the kind of man who could walk into a room and instantly draw people in. He had charm, confidence, and an easy smile that made others feel safe. Women found him attractive. Men respected him. He seemed like the kind of person destined for success, educated, intelligent, and ambitious. But beneath that calm, polite surface was something twisted, something hollow. Ted Bundy was not what he seemed. He was a predator who learned how to hide his hunger behind the perfect smile. He was born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. From the start, Bundy's life was built on a lie. He grew up believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. That secret, that confusion, stayed with him for years and quietly shaped the man he would become. Even as a child, Ted was strange. He stole things for no reason, played cruel tricks, and spent hours alone, watching people. He wasn't violent then, but there was something missing, something human. People later described him as cold, calculated, and detached, even when he pretended to be kind. As he grew older, Bundy learned how to blend in. He studied psychology at the University of Washington, worked on political campaigns, and volunteered at a suicide hotline. His coworkers remembered him as calm, friendly, and patient. The irony is almost unbearable, a man who listened to people at their lowest moments, saving lives, while secretly planning how to take them. He understood how people thought, how they trusted, how they feared, and he used that knowledge as a weapon. By the early 1970s, young women began to disappear across the Pacific Northwest. They were students, secretaries, daughters, all vanishing without a trace. Witnesses often mentioned a man named Ted, handsome and polite, with a cast on his arm or leg, asking for help carrying books to his car. The car was a beige Volkswagen Beetle, small and ordinary just like him. Inside that car, the walls held the last sounds of more than 30 women. It became his hunting ground and his cage of horror. Bundy would lure them in, knock them unconscious, and drive them to remote places where no one could hear them scream. For years, police were confused. Bundy moved between states, Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, leaving behind a trail of disappearances that looked random but were meticulously planned. He changed his name, his look, his routine. He was a ghost, intelligent enough to study police methods and always one step ahead. He watched his own investigation unfold on the news and smiled, knowing he was the man they were searching for. To him, it was a game, one he enjoyed far too much. But every perfect mask eventually cracks. In 1975, Bundy was stopped by police in Utah for driving suspiciously. Inside his car, they found a ski mask, a crowbar, rope, and handcuffs. To anyone else, it would have been obvious. But Bundy's calm explanations convinced them it was all a misunderstanding. Even when he was arrested later for kidnapping, he smiled through it, acting more like a student defending a thesis than a murderer defending his life. He studied law books, filed his own motions, and represented himself in court. Reporters loved him. Audiences found him fascinating. He wasn't just trying to win his case, he was performing, and the world was his audience. In 1977, during a pretrial hearing, Bundy made his first escape. He jumped from a second-story courthouse window and vanished into the mountains. He was caught 6 days later but escaped again months later, crawling through a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell. This time, he disappeared completely. For most people, prison is the end. For Ted Bundy, it was just another challenge to outsmart. He fled to Florida under a false identity, hoping to start over. But the darkness inside him was stronger than his disguise. Within weeks, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University and unleashed chaos. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy attacked 4 women as they slept, killing 2 and brutally injuring the others. His violence was frenzied, monstrous, and senseless. A few weeks later, he kidnapped and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. That was his final victim, and the end of his freedom. When Bundy was captured again, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man on his way to work, calm, neat, polite. He smiled at the cameras, confident that he could charm his way out again. But this time, his luck was gone. The evidence was overwhelming. During his Florida trial, Bundy became a national spectacle. He questioned witnesses, joked with the judge, and even proposed to a woman in the courtroom. It felt unreal, like a theater performance where the lead actor refused to admit his role in the tragedy. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But even then, Bundy wasn't finished performing. On death row, he gave interviews, shared selective confessions, and toyed with reporters. Sometimes he cried, sometimes he smiled. He admitted to more than 30 murders but refused to reveal details about many others. Investigators believed the true number could be far higher. He described killing as a possession, a need to have total control, body, soul, and memory. He said he couldn't stop because, in his mind, he was never doing anything wrong. He wasn't killing people, he was erasing them, claiming them, keeping them in a twisted way only he understood. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy sat in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, hundreds of people gathered, cheering as the lights flickered. They held signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn." For them, it was justice, a celebration that the nightmare was finally over. Inside, Bundy looked calm. His final words were soft. He asked that his love be given to his family. Then, with a final breath, the current surged and Ted Bundy, the man who fooled the world, was gone. But his shadow didn't vanish. Bundy became a symbol of evil that hides in plain sight. He proved that monsters don't always lurk in the dark. Sometimes they shake your hand, they smile, they make you laugh, they offer help, and that's what makes them truly terrifying. Ted Bundy wasn't the beast under the bed. He was the man holding the door open. His story isn't just about murder, it's about deception, control, and the chilling truth that evil often wears the face you least expect. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer looked like the quiet man who lived down the hall, polite, shy, and almost invisible. He didn't stand out, didn't draw attention. He kept to himself, worked simple jobs, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. But inside that silence, something monstrous was growing. Beneath his calm face was a man fighting urges too dark to control. He wasn't born evil, some would say, but something in him, something hollow and unfeeling, began to take over. What started as curiosity turned into obsession, and that obsession turned into horror. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His childhood was marked by loneliness. His parents fought constantly. His father was often away, and Jeffrey spent most of his time alone. As a boy, he was fascinated by dead animals. He would collect bones and roadkill, taking them apart to see what was inside. He said he wanted to understand how they worked, but there was something more, a fascination with what happened after life stopped. His father, thinking it was scientific curiosity, encouraged it. Neither of them knew that this strange hobby was the seed of something far darker. In high school, Dahmer was awkward but not violent. He drank heavily, even in class, trying to numb a growing emptiness he couldn't explain. He later said that by his teenage years, he began fantasizing about controlling someone completely, not just being with them, but owning them. He wanted to create a person who would never leave. It wasn't about sex or love, it was about power and fear. That thought never went away, it only grew stronger. In 1978, when Dahmer was 18, his parents divorced and he was left alone in their house. That's when it happened. His first victim was Stephen Hicks, a young man hitchhiking home from a concert. Dahmer invited him over for a few drinks. They laughed, talked, and for a moment everything seemed normal. But when Stephen said he had to leave, Dahmer panicked. He didn't want him to go. He grabbed a dumbbell and struck him on the head. It was over in seconds. Then Dahmer sat beside the body, not in shock but in a strange calm. He dismembered him, dissolved parts in acid, and buried the remains behind the house. It was the first time he killed, and it gave him a sense of control he'd never felt before. For nearly a decade after that, Dahmer managed to suppress his urges. He joined the army but was discharged due to drinking. He drifted through jobs and apartments, always lonely, always drinking. He was caught exposing himself in public and arrested for indecent behavior, but he always appeared remorseful and harmless. The courts let him go with light sentences. He knew how to play the quiet man, the one who didn't seem dangerous. But behind closed doors, the fantasies kept returning, louder and darker. By the late 1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer began killing again. He moved into a small apartment at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, a building that would soon become infamous. There, he lured men home from bars and bus stops with promises of money or drinks. Once they arrived, he drugged them. Some he strangled, others he killed in his sleep. Then came what truly set Dahmer apart: what happened after. He didn't just murder his victims. He posed their bodies, photographed them, kept parts as trophies: skulls, bones, hearts, even organs stored in his refrigerator. His apartment became a graveyard disguised as a home. The neighbors noticed the smell. They complained to the landlord about the rotting stench, but Dahmer calmly explained it away, said his freezer broke, or he had spoiled meat. No one suspected the truth. The man next door, quiet and polite, was dismembering people in his kitchen. He later admitted that he sometimes ate parts of his victims. He said it made him feel closer to them, that consuming them meant they could never leave. He tried to create living zombies by drilling holes into their heads and injecting acid, hopping to keep them alive but mindless. It was beyond madness. It was control taken to its absolute extreme. In total, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He photographed almost every victim, documenting each stage of their death and dissection as if preserving memories of his power. He lived among death like it was normal, eating breakfast beside skulls, sleeping beside bones, hiding horrors behind a locked bedroom door. The line between fantasy and reality was gone. For Dahmer, it was all one dark blur. But every killer slips up eventually. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer invited a man named Tracy Edwards to his apartment. Once inside, Edwards noticed the strange smell, the acid containers, the photographs on the wall. When Dahmer tried to handcuff him, Edwards fought back and escaped, flagging down 2 police officers on the street. They followed him back to the apartment, and what they found was beyond comprehension. Photographs of dismembered bodies, skulls lined neatly on shelves, and a refrigerator containing human remains. The truth was finally out. Dahmer was arrested on the spot. Even then, he was calm. In interviews, he spoke with a disturbing honesty, not proud but not fully remorseful either. He explained every detail of what he did as if describing something ordinary. He said he didn't kill out of hate. He killed because he couldn't stand being alone. He wanted to possess his victims completely, body and soul. To him, that was the only way they'd never leave. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, over 900 years in prison. Reporters described him as soft-spoken and polite, even as he talked about his crimes. Some said he looked relieved to finally be caught. For the first time in his life, he couldn't hurt anyone. But in prison, the monster he created couldn't hide forever. On November 28, 1994, another inmate, Christopher Scarver, attacked and killed Dahmer with a metal bar. Just like that, the story of the Milwaukee cannibal ended. But the horror he created didn't fade. His apartment was destroyed, but the photos, the evidence, and his words remained. He became a symbol not of rage or insanity, but of emptiness. A man who looked ordinary, spoke softly, and hid a world of nightmares behind his door. Jeffrey Dahmer's story is one of control, loneliness, and the darkest side of desire. He wanted to keep people forever, and in a twisted way, he did. His name, his crimes, his victims, all frozen in time. A reminder that sometimes evil doesn't scream. Sometimes it whispers. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was the man everyone trusted. A smiling neighbor, a friendly clown at children's parties, a local contractor who helped his community. But behind that painted smile was one of the most horrifying killers in American history, a man who hid dozens of bodies under his own home. His story isn't just about murder, it's about deception, about how evil can wear a friendly face and shake your hand before it destroys you. Gacy was born in 1942 in Chicago. On the surface, he had a normal childhood, but his home was filled with fear. His father was an abusive alcoholic who called him weak and beat him for the smallest mistakes. His mother tried to protect him, but she couldn't stop the violence. Gacy grew up desperate for approval, any kind of affection, any sign of respect. He learned early on how to pretend, how to smile even when he was in pain. That ability to fake normalcy would later become his mask, a mask far scarier than the clown makeup he would one day wear. As he grew older, Gacy became known as a hard worker and a charming talker. He ran several small businesses and joined community organizations. He even dressed up as Pogo the Clown, performing at hospitals and parties for kids. People loved him. They saw him as generous, funny, and reliable. No one suspected that behind the cheerful mask was a man already slipping into darkness. But the truth was, Gacy's desire for control, humiliation, and violence had been growing for years. He had a pattern: young men, often teenagers, often from troubled backgrounds. He would lure them with promises of work, money, or simply a place to stay. Once they were inside his home, they disappeared. In 1972, Gacy committed his first known murder. The victim was a teenage boy he had hired to help with construction work. After killing him, Gacy panicked, then realized how much he liked the feeling of power. He buried the boy under the crawl space of his house. Over time, that small space became a graveyard. He learned how to cover the smell with lime and concrete. He organized the bodies neatly, as if each one was a project he had completed. He continued his public life, hosting barbecues, meeting politicians, even taking photos with local officials, while the earth beneath his home filled with corpses. Gacy's method was terrifyingly routine. He would pick up young men, sometimes from bus stations, sometimes from the street, and bring them to his home. He called it a little game. He would handcuff them, pretending it was a magic trick. Once the cuffs clicked, they never came off. What followed was unspeakable torture. Gacy would assault and strangle his victims, often laughing or mocking them as they begged for their lives. He said later that he didn't see them as people. They were objects, disposable, replaceable. When he finished, he buried them under the floorboards or dumped them in a nearby river. Neighbors sometimes complained about the smell. Gacy blamed it on a broken sewer line. He always had an excuse ready, always smiling, always confident. It's what made him so dangerous. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man you could trust. He even volunteered in politics, meeting mayors and community leaders. He was the perfect illusion of goodness, the man next door who hid hell beneath his feet. By the mid-1970s, the disappearances in Chicago began to draw attention. Teenagers were vanishing without a trace. Police didn't suspect Gacy at first. After all, he was a respected businessman. But everything changed in December 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Peace disappeared after telling his mother he was going to talk to Gacy about a construction job. When the boy never came home, suspicion finally pointed toward the man everyone thought they knew. Investigators searched Gacy's house, and what they found still stands as one of the most horrifying discoveries in criminal history. Beneath the floors in the crawl space, they found human remains, bones tangled together, the stench of death rising through the ground. The deeper they dug, the worse it became. Body after body, layer after layer, some buried for years, some just days old. It was a house built on the dead. When confronted with the evidence, Gacy finally confessed. He said it was as if there were two people inside him, one good, one evil. He blamed his alter ego, his other self, for the murders. But the truth was simpler. Gacy enjoyed control. He enjoyed the fear. He planned his crimes carefully and took pride in how he fooled everyone around him. In total, he admitted to killing 33 young men and boys, though some believe the real number could be higher. The media gave him the nickname, the Killer Clown, a title that captured the twisted contrast between his public image and his hidden reality. That painted smile, once a symbol of fun and laughter, became a symbol of horror. The idea that a man who entertained children could also bury them under his home shook America to its core. People began to look differently at the faces around them, wondering what secrets might be hiding behind polite smiles. In 1980, John Wayne Gacy was convicted of 33 counts of murder. He showed little remorse during the trial, even joking with guards and reporters. He painted in prison, mostly pictures of clowns, bright and cheerful, eerily similar to the mask he used to wear. His paintings were later sold for thousands of dollars, collected by people fascinated by his evil. But there was nothing glamorous about what he did. His charm, his jokes, his clown makeup, all of it was a cover for years of unimaginable suffering. Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. His final words were chillingly simple: "Kiss my ass." Even at the end, he refused to show regret. The same arrogance that helped him hide for so long stayed with him until his last breath. After his death, his house was demolished, the ground leveled, the crawl space filled. But the memory of what happened there never left. For the families of his victims, the pain still echoes. John Wayne Gacy's story is a nightmare of normalcy, a reminder that evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it shakes your hand. Sometimes it paints its face and makes balloon animals for your children. Beneath his clown costume was a man who craved control, who wanted to play God with the lives of the innocent. And even after death, his story lingers, a painted grin frozen in the darkness, a mask that reminds us how easily trust can turn into terror. Richard Ramirez. Los Angeles, 1984. A city basking in sunlight by day but drowning in fear by night. It was the summer of open windows, warm air, and sleepless eyes, because somewhere in the shadows, a predator was moving. He didn't care about who you were, what neighborhood you lived in, or how safe you thought you were. He came for anyone, anywhere, at any time. His name was Richard Ramirez, but the world came to know him by another, the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez wasn't like other killers. He wasn't careful. He wasn't methodical. He was chaos itself, unpredictable, unfiltered, pure evil in human form. His crimes were so brutal and random that the city itself seemed haunted by his presence. For a year, Los Angeles turned into a hunting ground, and every dark night became a roll of the dice on survival. Richard Leyva Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960. His childhood was a storm of violence and neglect. His father was abusive, beating him for the smallest mistakes. But worse than that was his cousin Miguel, a war veteran who had fought in Vietnam. Miguel would show young Richard photos of women he had tortured and killed overseas. He taught him that fear was power, that death was control. One day, Richard watched Miguel shoot his wife in the face right in front of him. He was only 12. That moment, that flash of horror, never left him. Something inside him broke, and the boy who stood in that room began to fade into darkness. By his teenage years, Ramirez had fallen deep into drugs and crime. He slept in graveyards, worshipped Satan, and began to see himself as an agent of darkness, chosen, untouchable. He became obsessed with death, torture, and the idea of being feared. When he moved to Los Angeles in the early 1980s, that obsession found its outlet. The city was wide open, full of unlocked doors and sleeping victims. It didn't take long before he acted on his fantasies. His first known murder was in 1984, a woman named Jenny Vincow. She was 79 years old. Ramirez broke into her apartment through an open window, stabbed her repeatedly, and mutilated her body. It wasn't just violence, it was rage. Police were stunned by the brutality, but there were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no suspect, and that was just the beginning. What made Ramirez so terrifying was his unpredictability. He didn't stick to a type or a method. One night, he would break into a wealthy home in the suburbs. The next, he'd attack a small apartment in a poor neighborhood. His victims were men, women, and even children. He used guns, knives, cords, anything he could find. He didn't just kill, he made people suffer, both physically and psychologically. He told survivors to swear to Satan instead of God. He carved pentagrams into walls and bodies. It wasn't just murder. It was ritual, his way of declaring allegiance to the darkness he believed in. The media began calling him the Night Stalker, and the name fit perfectly. He struck at night, entering homes silently like a shadow slipping through the cracks. People started sleeping with their lights on, buying new locks and keeping weapons by their beds. The city's fear became so thick it felt alive. For months, the police couldn't catch him. He seemed to vanish after every attack, leaving behind only blood, fear, and that same haunting symbol, the pentagram. But Ramirez wasn't invincible. His arrogance grew with each murder. He began stealing cars, leaving evidence, making mistakes. One night after attacking a couple, he left a footprint, a distinctive shoe print from an Avia sneaker. Detectives used it to link multiple crimes together. For the first time, they realized all these separate horrors were the work of one man. The Night Stalker wasn't a myth, he was real, and he was still out there. By 1985, the entire state of California was gripped by panic. The police released a sketch of the suspect based on eyewitness accounts. Ramirez's face was finally known, tall, gaunt, with wild hair and dark, piercing eyes. When the sketch hit the news, people started recognizing him on the street. He didn't even know it yet, but his days of terror were numbered. On August 31, 1985, everything fell apart. Ramirez had gone to visit family in East Los Angeles, unaware that his photo was on every TV and newspaper in the state. When he entered a convenience store, people began whispering, "That's him." Someone pointed, someone screamed, and Ramirez panicked. He ran out of the store and tried to steal a car. But the neighborhood was ready. Dozens of locals chased him down, beating him with pipes and sticks. By the time police arrived, the Night Stalker was bleeding, handcuffed, and begging for his life. The monster who had terrified millions was finally caught, not by police, but by the very people he hunted. His trial was as strange as his crimes. Ramirez smiled in court, flashed a pentagram carved into his hand, and shouted, "Hail Satan," at reporters. He showed no remorse, no fear, no humanity. He became a symbol of pure evil, charming some, horrifying others. Women wrote him love letters in prison, drawn to his dark charisma. But behind the smirk was a man who believed he was untouchable, chosen by darkness itself. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was found guilty of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and 11 sexual assaults. He was sentenced to death. His response was chilling. "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory." He spent the rest of his life on death row, never showing regret. In 2013, before his execution could take place, Ramirez died of cancer at 53. Even in death, his story left scars. What made Ramirez truly terrifying wasn't just the violence. It was the randomness. He didn't kill for money or revenge or even pleasure. He killed because he wanted to spread fear. He believed in evil as a force, and he wanted to be its messenger. To him, every scream was proof that Satan was real. Every newspaper headline was his trophy. The Night Stalker turned Los Angeles into a city of fear, a place where darkness ruled and every shadow felt alive. But in the end, it was Satan or fate that stopped him. It was the people he underestimated, ordinary men and women who refused to be afraid anymore. Richard Ramirez will forever remain a name that chills the blood, not because of what he did alone, but because of what he represented. The idea that evil doesn't need a reason, doesn't need a face, and can walk beside us under the same warm California sun. Jack the Ripper. London, 1888. The air was thick with fog, the streets slick with rain, and in the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, something evil was watching. It was a time of poverty, desperation, and fear. A world where darkness wasn't just the absence of light, but the presence of something hunting in it. No one knew his name, no one saw his face, but everyone knew what he left behind. They called him Jack the Ripper, and he became the most infamous killer the world had ever known, not because of how many he killed, but because of how perfectly he vanished. Whitechapel was the perfect hunting ground, crowded, filthy, and filled with people society didn't care about. Women walked the streets at night to earn a few coins, sleeping where they could and drinking to forget the cold. The police were overworked, the city overwhelmed. And in that chaos, Jack appeared, a ghost in human form, slipping between shadows, choosing victims no one would miss. He didn't just murder, he dissected, cutting with precision that suggested knowledge, a doctor perhaps, or a butcher. That was the first clue that London's monster wasn't just cruel, he was skilled. His first known victim was Mary Ann Nichols, found on August 31, 1888. Her throat had been slit, her abdomen mutilated, her body left in the open like a warning. The brutality was shocking, even for Whitechapel. But before the city could breathe, it happened again and again. Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, 5 women, known as the Canonical Five, killed within just a few months. Each murder was worse than the last, as if the killer was learning, evolving, perfecting his craft. By the end, the killings weren't just about death. They were about control, ritual, and sending a message carved in blood. The press exploded with the story. Newspapers printed every grisly detail, selling millions of copies overnight. For the first time, crime had become public entertainment, a national obsession. People demanded to know who could do something like this. The name Jack the Ripper first appeared in a letter sent to police, supposedly written by the killer himself. It was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." No one knew if it was real or a hoax, but the name stuck. It became legend. Suddenly, Jack wasn't just a killer. He was a phantom, an idea, the embodiment of fear itself. The police tried everything. Detectives searched every corner of Whitechapel, questioned hundreds of people, and even used early forensic techniques. But Jack was always one step ahead. He struck silently, vanished instantly, and left no clues that made sense. Some said he was a surgeon. Others believed he was a foreign sailor, a butcher, or even a member of the royal family. The theories spread like wildfire. Everyone had a suspect, but no one had proof. And that was Jack's true power: invisibility. He wasn't just killing people, he was dismantling the illusion of safety itself. The murders were savage but deliberate. The killer's knife was sharp and steady. He removed organs, targeted specific parts of the body, and showed an almost surgical knowledge of anatomy. That led investigators to think he might have been a medical man, someone who understood how to cut without hesitation. Others said it was too clean to be medical, that this was a man who worked with animals, not people. Each theory added to the mystery, but the truth remained hidden. The fog of Whitechapel wasn't just weather. It was the perfect cover for a man who thrived in darkness. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The last known victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was found on November 9, 1888, her body so mutilated that even the detectives who'd seen it never forgot. After that, nothing. No more bodies, no more letters. Jack the Ripper vanished as if he had never existed. The killings ended, but the fear remained. People wondered, did he die? Did he move somewhere else? Or had he simply decided his work was complete? No one knew. And that uncertainty, that void, is what made him immortal. Over the decades, the Ripper's identity became one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. Hundreds of suspects have been named. Montague Drute, a barrister who drowned himself soon after the last murder. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber with a violent past. Walter Sickert, a painter obsessed with the crimes. Even Prince Albert Victor, a member of the royal family. Books, movies, and investigations have tried to solve it, but none have ever provided proof. DNA tests on old letters and evidence have given hints, but never answers. Jack remains faceless, eternal, a symbol of evil that outlived his time. What makes Jack the Ripper so terrifying isn't just what he did, it's what he represents. He showed the world that monsters don't need to hide in the woods or wear masks. They can walk through crowded streets, blend with the crowd, and disappear into the night. He turned the act of killing into a legend. His victims, poor, forgotten women, became part of a story much bigger than themselves. The tragedy is that their names are often remembered only because of the man who murdered them. Even now, more than a century later, his shadow lingers. Tourists walk through the same alleys where his victims fell, following ghost tours that whisper his name in the fog. The houses are gone, the streets modernized, but at night when the mist rolls in, it's easy to imagine him still there, a flicker of movement behind the gaslight, a footstep echoing too close behind. Jack the Ripper has become more than a man. He's a myth, a warning. Proof that evil doesn't always get caught. and that some stories never find an ending. Jack the Ripper may have killed 5, but he haunted millions. He turned fear into fascination, murder into mystery. His identity died with him, buried somewhere beneath the fog of Victorian London. But his legacy, that chilling reminder of what hides behind human faces, still whispers in the dark. And maybe that's exactly what he wanted, not just to be remembered, but to never be forgotten. Dennis Nilsen. London, late 1970s. The city was gray, cold, and restless, a place where thousands of lives brushed past each other every day unseen. Among them walked a quiet, polite man named Dennis Nilsen. To his neighbors, he was normal, kind even. A civil servant, soft-spoken, friendly with dogs, and known for helping others. But behind his calm smile and tidy flat, Nilsen was living in a nightmare of his own making, one built on loneliness, obsession, and death. He wasn't the kind of killer who hunted in alleys or struck from the shadows. His murders happened quietly, at home, between cups of tea and music on the radio. Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945 in Scotland. His childhood was marked by isolation. His father abandoned the family when he was young, and his mother remarried, leaving Nilsen feeling unwanted and invisible. But it was his relationship with death that began shaping him early. When his grandfather, the only person he loved, died suddenly, Nilsen was allowed to see the body. He was just 6 years old. He later said that moment changed everything. He felt a strange mix of fear and comfort, a fascination with the stillness of death. That feeling never left him. As he grew older, it twisted into something far darker. Nilsen joined the army as a young man and served as a cook. He learned to handle knives, meat, and blood, skills that would later return in horrifying ways. After leaving the military, he drifted through jobs: police officer, civil servant, housing clerk. Outwardly, he lived an ordinary life, but inside, he was falling apart. He struggled with his sexuality, afraid of rejection and desperate for affection. He didn't want to be alone, yet he couldn't form lasting relationships. Instead, he began fantasizing about having a partner who would never leave, someone who couldn't leave. By 1978, those fantasies became real. That year, he met a man named Stephen Holmes at a pub and invited him back to his flat. They drank, talked, and fell asleep. But when Nilsen woke up the next morning and realized the man would soon leave, panic took over. He strangled him with a necktie and drowned him in a bucket of water. Later, he washed the body, dressed it, and sat beside it, watching TV, drinking, pretending his guest was still alive. For days, he lived with the corpse, speaking to it, moving it around the apartment. Eventually, he hid the remains under the floorboards. He later said it wasn't the killing that excited him. It was the company that came after. That first murder opened a door he could never close. Over the next 5 years, Nilsen killed at least 12 young men, mostly drifters, students, or homeless individuals he met in bars or on the street. He offered food, alcohol, or a place to stay. They followed him home, grateful, unaware that they were walking into their graves. Once inside, he would strangle them, often using a tie or belt. Then he bathed the bodies, dressed them, and kept them in his flat, sometimes sleeping beside them, talking to them, treating them like companions. When decomposition began, he dismembered them, boiling heads in pots, flushing remains down the toilet, or burning bones in his backyard. To him, death was not an ending, it was preservation. He told police later, "I killed to keep them with me." He didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a lonely man who couldn't bear to be abandoned again. The tragedy is that his victims were often people no one looked for. Many were young gay men, runaways, or struggling with poverty. When they vanished, few asked questions. And so Nilsen continued, year after year. His life divided neatly between his normal job and the secret horror waiting behind his locked door. By 1981, Nilsen had moved into a new apartment at 23 Cranley Gardens. Unlike his old home, this flat didn't have floorboards to hide bodies under. Instead, he began cutting them up and trying to flush the remains down the drain. It was a mistake that would finally expose him. In February 1983, Neighbors complained that the building's plumbing was blocked and smelled terrible. When plumbers investigated, they found something clogging the pipes, something pale, fleshy, and unmistakably human. The police were called immediately. When officers knocked on Nilsson's door, he didn't resist. He calmly made tea, sat down, and said, "It's a long story. You'll want to see what's in the cupboard." Inside, they found plastic bags filled with human remains, heads, torsos, limbs. In the fridge were body parts carefully wrapped and labeled. The smell was overwhelming. Nilsson spoke about it all as if describing chores. He told them how he killed, dismembered, and disposed of his victims. He even apologized for the mess. His voice was flat, emotionless, detached, as if the murders were something that happened to someone else. During interrogation, Nilsson showed no hatred, no anger. Instead, he talked about loneliness, about wanting company, about not wanting people to leave. He said he would make tea for the bodies, prop them up in chairs, watch television beside them. To him, death was just a way to make sure the relationship would never end. The police were stunned. It wasn't rage or pleasure that drove him, it was emptiness. He didn't kill for thrill. He killed to fill a void that could never be filled. In 1983, Dennis Nilsson was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. In court, he pleaded insanity, claiming he couldn't control his impulses. But the jury saw through it. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years. A sentence later changed to whole life, meaning he would never be released. Even in prison, he remained detached, writing journals and giving interviews where he described his crimes with chilling calmness. He died in 2018 at the age of 72. The horror of Dennis Nilsson isn't in the violence alone, it's in the stillness. He wasn't a hunter in the dark or a masked predator. He was an ordinary man who turned his loneliness into a graveyard. His crimes showed how isolation, obsession, and emotional emptiness could twist into something unspeakable. He saw death not as destruction, but as possession. His victims didn't just die, they were trapped in his world, held by a man who couldn't let go. Even now, his story haunts London. The quiet apartment, the blocked drains, the polite man who waved to neighbors while keeping corpses in his home. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles and asks if you'd like another drink. Tsutomu Miyazaki. In the late 1980s, Japan was in the middle of an economic boom, neon lights, rising cities, endless optimism. But beneath that modern glow, something monstrous was forming in the shadows. In a quiet suburb outside Tokyo lived a man whose crimes would horrify an entire nation and shatter Japan's image of safety. His name was Tsutomu Miyazaki, but he would later be known as the otaku killer, the little girl murderer, and the human Dracula. His story is not only about murder, it's about loneliness, obsession, and the dark side of a society that looked perfect on the outside. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born in 1962 with a physical deformity. His hands were fused to his wrists in a way that made them look small and twisted, almost childlike. Because of it, he grew up isolated and constantly bullied. His parents were cold, distant, and ashamed of him. He was ignored at home, mocked at school, and left to disappear into his own world. To escape, he turned to manga, horror films, and videotapes, hundreds of them. His room became a shrine to fantasy, packed with anime, pornography, and graphic horror. When his grandfather, the only person who showed him love, died, something inside him snapped. He stole the man's ashes and kept them in his bedroom, sleeping beside them every night. Soon, he began losing touch with reality. Between 1988 and 1989, Miyazaki committed a series of crimes that would stun Japan forever. Over a period of just 1 year, he kidnapped and murdered 4 little girls, all between the ages of 4 and 7. He didn't stalk them for long. He simply saw them playing alone near parks or quiet streets, offered them a ride or distraction, and took them to remote areas. What happened next was beyond comprehension. He strangled them, then mutilated their bodies, often taking parts home with him. He took photos, recorded videos, and even performed acts that showed how far his mind had descended into darkness. Later, He would return to the crime scenes, leaving behind notes or remains as if to relive his actions. But Miyazaki's evil didn't stop there. After the murders, he did something that made the case even more disturbing. He began contacting the victims' families. He called them repeatedly, breathing into the phone without speaking. In one case, he mailed a letter to a victim's home, a letter made from cut-out magazine letters that simply said, "There was a body. Yes, I killed her." He even sent some remains of one child, including ashes and teeth, to her parents. It was as if he wanted to make sure the families could never escape the horror, to make them live inside his nightmare. The police were baffled. Japan had never seen a case like this before. Serial killers were almost unheard of there, and the brutality of his crimes went against every cultural norm of restraint and order. When the police finally caught Miyazaki in 1989, it wasn't through investigation, it was by accident. He was spotted by a father who caught him trying to photograph his daughter naked in a park. When confronted, Miyazaki ran to his car, but the man and others managed to stop him and hold him until police arrived. Inside his car and later his apartment, investigators found something horrifying: over 6,000 videotapes stacked floor to ceiling. Among them were horror movies, anime, violent pornography, and even recordings of the news coverage about his own crimes. On one shelf, labeled with neat handwriting, were videotapes containing his own recordings of the victims. Police said his apartment smelled like death and obsession. The media dubbed him the otaku murderer, blaming his obsession with anime and horror films for the killings. Overnight, Japan's otaku subculture, the community of young people deeply into animation and pop culture, was demonized. The public wanted answers. How could someone so quiet, so invisible, do something so monstrous? Psychologists later described him as emotionally detached, unable to distinguish between fantasy and reality. He told investigators that he killed to fulfill a fantasy and that he didn't see the victims as real people. He said they were part of his world. When asked why he contacted the families, he said he wanted to feel their fear. During interrogation, Miyazaki remained eerily calm. He showed no remorse. He spoke softly, almost politely, and sometimes referred to himself in the third person, saying another personality had committed the murders. At times, he claimed that an alter ego, a rat-like creature, had taken control of him. His behavior in custody was bizarre. He refused food, drew disturbing sketches, and even tried to eat his own hand. Doctors diagnosed him with multiple personality disorder and schizophrenia, but others said he was fully aware of what he was doing. To the court, it didn't matter. His crimes were too brutal, too deliberate. The trial dragged on for years, and the courtroom was often filled with reporters, psychologists, and horrified parents. Miyazaki's calm demeanor and strange statements made him even more terrifying. He never apologized, never admitted guilt. Instead, he said he was misunderstood, that his dark self had taken over. But his victims' families didn't believe it. For them, he was not a sick man, he was evil. In 1997, after 8 long years of trials, Tsutomu Miyazaki was sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging in 2008. Even decades later, his crimes haunt Japan. His case changed the way the nation viewed mental illness, crime, and media influence. Parents became fearful of letting children out alone. The government cracked down on violent content in media. And the word otaku, once meaning simply fan, became a symbol of isolation and danger. But the truth about Miyazaki was deeper than cartoons or horror films. His obsession was only the surface. Beneath it was a man crushed by loneliness, warped by neglect, and consumed by the desire for control over the only thing he could never have: human connection. Tsutomu Miyazaki's story is one of isolation turning into evil. He was not born a monster. He was shaped by rejection, loneliness, and fantasy that became obsession. In the end, his world was not full of life, but of shadows and screens where reality and nightmare were the same thing. When he was finally hanged, there was no outrage, no sympathy, only silence. But that silence still echoes in Japan, reminding everyone that even in a land of peace and order, horror can live quietly, behind a locked door, surrounded by videotapes and ghosts. Gary Ridgway. In the quiet suburbs of Washington state, near the damp forests and the cold gray rivers, women began to vanish. They were young, mostly runaways or sex workers, women who slipped through the cracks of society, women few would notice were gone. But someone noticed. Someone was watching, waiting, and choosing them. His name was Gary Ridgway, and for more than 2 decades he was the shadow that haunted the Pacific Northwest. History would remember him as the Green River Killer, one of the most prolific serial murderers in American history. Gary Leon Ridgway was born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, and grew up in a working-class family that looked normal from the outside, but hid a deep dysfunction. His father was strict and often absent, and his mother was controlling, dominant, and strangely affectionate in ways that confused him. She bathed him well into his teenage years, and Ridgway later admitted that he developed sexual feelings of shame and anger toward her. That blend, lust, control, and resentment would shape his entire life. He struggled in school, failed multiple times, and was often described as slow and withdrawn. But beneath his quiet demeanor, there was something cold, something calculating forming in his mind. As an adult, Ridgway joined the Navy and later worked as a truck painter at a local factory. To most people, he was boringly normal, a man who clocked in, did his job, and kept to himself. He married multiple times, went to church regularly, and even read the Bible at work. He was polite to his neighbors. No one suspected anything. But on weekends and late nights, Ridgway cruised the highways near Seattle, picking up women from the red light districts. He said he hated prostitutes, but he was drawn to them. They were vulnerable, available, and easily forgotten. He would offer them money for sex, drive them to remote wooded areas, and once they were alone, he would strangle them, often with his bare hands, sometimes with their own clothing. Then he would dump the bodies near the Green River, leaving them like discarded trash. It started in 1982, when the bodies of 5 young women were discovered floating in the Green River near Kent, Washington. Each had been strangled. Each was naked. Each had been left in the same area, as if the killer wanted police to find them. The discovery sparked one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. The press called him the Green River Killer, and panic spread through Seattle's streets. Police found few clues, no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no clear pattern beyond the location. Meanwhile, Ridgway kept killing. He worked methodically, often targeting women he'd already met before. He returned to the dumping sites again and again, sometimes to have sex with the corpses, long after the bodies had begun to decompose. Later, he would calmly tell investigators that he did it because it was easier than finding another woman. Gary Ridgway was a master of blending in. He maintained a steady job for decades, paid his bills, and even joined search parties to look for victims he had killed himself. At one point, he even attended a community meeting about the murders, sitting among worried citizens while police discussed how to catch the monster. He smiled quietly, unnoticed. When detectives interviewed him in 1984 as part of the investigation, he was cooperative, polite, and calm. They had no hard evidence, only suspicion, so they let him go. It would be nearly 20 more years before his mask finally slipped. As the years went on, the bodies kept appearing in rivers, ravines, and forest clearings. Some victims were left in clusters, like a pattern only he understood. Many were never identified. At the time, DNA technology was still primitive and the investigation stretched thin. Detectives grew frustrated, leads went nowhere. Ridgway seemed invisible. By the late 1990s, he had killed at least 49 women, possibly more than 70. He later confessed that he lost count. To him, the women weren't people, they were things, he said, objects for sex and disposal. He claimed that once he started, he couldn't stop. The urge came like hunger. It was my career, he said. Everything changed in 2001. By then, forensic technology had advanced enough to re-examine old evidence. DNA taken from Ridgway in the 1980s, a saliva sample collected after one of his earlier interviews, finally matched semen found on several of the victims. After nearly 2 decades of hunting, police had their killer. When they arrested him outside the truck plant where he worked, he didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He simply said, "I've been expecting this." What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in criminal history. Over the next months, Ridgway calmly described how he would lure women, earn their trust, and then strangle them once they were isolated. He said he preferred manual strangulation because it was more personal. He talked about how he'd go home after each murder, eat dinner, and sleep soundly. He even described how he'd revisit the dump sites to relive his crimes, sometimes bringing small souvenirs back home. The detectives who listened were horrified by his lack of emotion. One said it was like talking to a man explaining how he fixes a car. In 2003, Gary Ridgway made a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for sparing him the death penalty, he agreed to confess to every murder he could remember. He led police to sites they never knew existed, shallow graves hidden deep in the forest. He spoke about the women as if they were statistics, not humans. For the families of the victims, it was devastating. Many had waited decades for answers. Some would never get them, as dozens of women remain unidentified to this day. When the final count was read, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 49 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history at the time. In court, he stood silent as the families spoke through tears and rage. When it was his turn to speak, he apologized in a flat voice, saying, "I'm sorry for killing so many women. I didn't know how to stop." In 2003, he was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 480 years for tampering with evidence. He spends his life now in solitary confinement at Washington State Penitentiary. Even in prison, he remains eerily calm, reading the Bible, painting, and writing letters. Some investigators say he's incapable of true guilt. Others believe he feels satisfaction knowing he will always be remembered. The story of Gary Ridgway is not one of madness or impulse, it's one of method. He wasn't driven by rage or chaos. He was organized, patient, and deliberate. He hid his darkness behind normalcy, behind a factory uniform and a fake smile. He proved that evil doesn't always scream, sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it goes to work every day, comes home to mow the lawn and prays before bed. And somewhere, deep in the woods of Washington, the river still flows, carrying with it the ghosts of the forgotten, and the echo of a man who thought he could wash away his sins in the Green River. Richard Chase. They called him the Vampire of Sacramento. Not because it sounded poetic, but because it was true. Richard Trenton Chase wasn't a metaphorical monster. He was a man who actually drank human blood. Behind his pale, distant eyes lived something far darker than insanity. His crimes weren't driven by rage, greed, or even pleasure. They came from a twisted belief that his own body was dying, and that the only way to stay alive was to consume the life of others. Richard Chase was born in 1950 in a quiet California suburb that looked ordinary from the outside. But even as a child, he was far from normal. He wet the bed until his teens, started fires for fun, and tortured animals, 3 traits that psychologists later called the McDonald Triad, early signs of violent psychopathy. His home life didn't help. His father was controlling and abusive, while his mother suffered from paranoia and mental illness. The young Richard grew up in a house filled with shouting, fear, and instability. And in that chaos, something began to unravel inside him. As a teenager, Chase was a strange, detached boy. He became obsessed with death and blood. He'd stare at his own reflection for hours, convinced his heart had stopped beating. He'd hold oranges to his head, believing the vitamin C could be absorbed directly through his skull. He once told classmates that his blood was turning to powder, that his stomach was backward, and that someone was stealing his organs. He wasn't joking. By his early 20s, his delusions had grown into full-blown psychosis. He moved out on his own, but his apartment quickly turned into a nightmare. The walls were stained with blood, not his own, but from the rabbits, dogs, and cats he killed and dissected. He blended their organs in a blender and drank them with Coca-Cola. To him, it was medicine. He believed his blood was evaporating, that his body was decomposing from the inside, and that only the blood of living creatures could save him. Neighbors would later recall the smell, a nauseating mix of rot and iron that seeped through the walls. In 1975, his condition worsened so dramatically that he was institutionalized after injecting rabbit blood into his veins. Doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia and treated him with antipsychotic medication. For a brief time, he stabilized, quiet, polite, and seemingly harmless. But when he was released in 1976, his mother, against doctors' advice, took him off his medication. Within months, the voices and delusions returned. The vampire of Sacramento was about to wake up. His descent into murder began in December 1977. He shot and killed Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old man, in a random drive-by shooting. It was his first human kill, a test. He wanted to see what it felt like to take a life, but the real horror began a few weeks later. On January 23, 1978, Chase broke into the home of Teresa Wallen, a young woman who was 3 months pregnant. What he did next was beyond comprehension. He shot her once, then dragged her body into the bedroom. There, he mutilated her with a knife, removed several organs, and collected her blood in a yogurt cup to drink. He smeared blood on her face and walls. When police later arrived, they found dog feces shoved into her mouth, a final act of pure derangement. But Richard Chase wasn't done. He was just beginning. 3 days later, he broke into another house, this time belonging to Evelyn Miroth, a 38-year-old mother. Inside were her 6-year-old son Jason, her nephew David, and a friend, Dan Meredith. When Meredith tried to stop Chase, he was shot point-blank in the head. Chase then murdered Evelyn and the children in acts of unspeakable violence. He mutilated their bodies, drank their blood, and performed necrophilic acts on Evelyn's corpse. When police arrived, the scene looked like something out of a nightmare. Blood coated the walls, floors, and even the ceiling. A baby bottle sat on the counter filled not with milk, but with blood. The entire city of Sacramento went into panic. Parents locked their doors. News stations warned of a vampire killer on the loose. Chase didn't try to hide. In fact, he seemed almost careless, walking around covered in stains, buying animal parts from local pet stores and carrying weapons in public. His appearance and smell gave him away. When investigators tracked him down to his filthy apartment, what they found froze even seasoned detectives. The place was filled with blood-stained dishes, pieces of flesh, and animal carcasses. On the refrigerator door was a blender, still half full of dark red liquid. Chase was arrested on January 27, 1978. During interrogation, he confessed to everything with a calm, almost childlike detachment. He spoke about his need to drink blood to stay alive, his belief that the Nazis were controlling him through poison, and how his heart would stop beating unless he fed. His words were not those of a man making excuses. They were the ramblings of a mind completely devoured by madness. At his trial, the question wasn't whether he did it, but whether he was sane enough to know right from wrong. His lawyers argued insanity. The prosecution argued evil. The jury decided both could be true. Richard Chase was found guilty of 6 murders and sentenced to death in the gas chamber, but he would never make it that far. On December 26, 1980, 2 years after his conviction, guards found him dead in his cell. He had overdosed on antidepressant pills he had hoarded over weeks. He died quietly, alone, his body finally at peace, his demons silenced at last. Even today, Richard Chase's name lingers like a nightmare you can't fully wake from. Unlike other serial killers who hunted for control or fame, Chase's crimes were the product of pure psychosis. He didn't kill for pleasure, he killed because he believed he had to. His mind had become its own prison, its own universe of horror where blood was medicine and death was salvation. The case of the vampire of Sacramento forces us to face a terrifying question. What happens when a human mind fractures beyond repair? When the line between life and death, sanity and madness, dissolves completely? Richard Chase's story doesn't offer answers. It only offers a mirror, one that reflects the darkness that can exist in the most fragile parts of the human mind. Because sometimes, the monster isn't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it's the shadow itself. The Smiley Face Killers. It began with bodies in the water. Young men, mostly college students, all found drowned in rivers, lakes, or canals across America. Their deaths were labeled accidents, tragic but explainable. Police reports said the same thing every time. Intoxicated young men, nights of drinking, a wrong turn near the water, and an unfortunate fall. But then, someone started connecting the dots. And once you saw the pattern, it was impossible to unsee it. The theory became known as the Smiley Face Killers, one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in modern American crime. Between the late 1990s and the 2010s, over 40 young men were found dead under eerily similar circumstances. The victims all fit a narrow profile: healthy, athletic, intelligent men, most in their 20s. They went missing after a night out with friends, and their bodies were discovered days or weeks later, floating in rivers miles from where they were last seen. And near many of the scenes, spray-painted on walls, bridges, or underpasses, investigators claimed to find the same cryptic image: a smiley face. What started as a coincidence soon grew into a chilling theory, one that suggested something much darker was at work. The idea first took shape in the early 2000s when two retired New York detectives, Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, began investigating the death of a young man named Patrick McNeil. Patrick had disappeared in 1997 after leaving a Manhattan bar. His body was found 2 months later, miles down the East River. The case was ruled an accidental drowning, but Gannon wasn't convinced. He noticed strange marks on the body, signs that didn't match a simple drowning. And then near the spot where Patrick had last been seen, there was graffiti, a crude smiley face. At first it seemed meaningless, but as Gannon and Duarte dug deeper, they found other cases across the Midwest, eerily similar deaths, eerily similar graffiti. In Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in Iowa, in Ohio, all the same pattern. Young men vanish after a night of drinking, only to be found dead in a river days later, and near several of those scenes, another smiley face. To Gannon and Duarte, it wasn't random, it was ritual. They began to build a theory that these men weren't victims of drunken accidents, but of a coordinated network of killers operating across multiple states. The so-called Smiley Face Killers. The smiley face symbol, they claimed, wasn't a coincidence at all, but a signature, a taunt, left behind by the murderers. It represented control, power, and mockery. It was the face of something organized, methodical, and invisible. The FBI, however, wasn't convinced. Officially, the Bureau dismissed the theory, calling it not credible and attributing the deaths to simple misadventure. Their reasoning was practical. There was no direct evidence of foul play in most of the cases. No witnesses, no consistent forensic proof, and no confirmed link between the smiley face graffiti and the victims. To them, it was a myth built from grief, a pattern seen in chaos. But not everyone was willing to let it go. Because the more people looked, the stranger it became. In several cases, the victims had been missing for days, yet their bodies showed signs of only being in the water for a short time. Some showed unexplained bruising or traces of chemicals that could suggest sedation. Others appeared to have been carefully placed in the water, not drowned naturally. There were even reports of CCTV footage showing victims walking away from bars, only to seemingly vanish mid-frame. And then there were the smiley faces drawn not just once, but dozens of times across multiple states, always near where bodies were found. Coincidence? Maybe. But for those who believed, it was the signature of a hidden darkness running through America's quiet towns and cities. Documentaries, podcasts, and online investigators began to spread the story. People started calling it the nation's most ignored serial killing spree. Reddit threads and YouTube deep dives dissected every case, every symbol, every photo of graffiti. Some claimed the smiley faces weren't just random art, they were a code, a way for members of an underground group to mark their work. Others said it wasn't a group at all, but one elusive killer who traveled across the country, leaving his trademark grin behind after each murder. The more the theory spread, the more real it felt. And then came the patterns of fear: college towns near rivers, bars by the waterfront missing posters of young men who fit the same description. Parents began to warn their sons not to walk home alone at night. Police departments across the Midwest were flooded with calls from families who were certain their loved one was one of the smiley face victims. Still, the truth remains buried beneath the water. To this day, not a single confirmed suspect has been identified. The smiley face graffiti, whether coincidence or clue, has never been proven to connect one case to another. The FBI maintains that the theory has no factual basis, that the deaths are isolated, tragic drownings, nothing more. But for those who have seen the crime scene photos, read the reports, and connected the timelines, the coincidences are too perfect to ignore. It's the absence of evidence that makes the theory so haunting. No fingerprints, no footprints, no clear motive, just a trail of lost lives and painted smiles, a pattern of death hidden in plain sight. The smiley face killer's theory lives somewhere between fact and folklore, that gray space where true crime becomes urban legend. It forces us to confront something deeply unsettling: the idea that evil can move quietly, invisibly through the world, leaving only symbols behind. Whether it's a network of murderers, a single predator, or just the cruel randomness of fate, no one can say for sure. Maybe the graffiti is just coincidence. Maybe the rivers simply take the lost and the careless. Or maybe, somewhere out there, someone is still smiling. The Chicago Ripper Crew. In the early 1980s, Chicago was a city already haunted by the ghosts of violence. The skyline glittered with ambition, but beneath its steel and concrete ran streets heavy with fear. It was a time when headlines spoke of corruption, gang wars, and the lingering shadow of serial killers like John Wayne Gacy. Yet within that same city, another horror began to take shape, one that was quieter, stranger, and far more disturbing. A group of 4 men who would come to be known as the Chicago Ripper Crew, a name that would forever stain the city's history with a darkness few could comprehend. It began, as these stories often do, with one man's twisted power over others. His name was Robin Gecht, a construction worker, husband, and father. Outwardly, he was an ordinary man, blending seamlessly into the hum of Chicago life. He had once worked for John Wayne Gacy, though there's no proof they ever shared more than a brief connection. Still, the fact alone feels symbolic, as if the nightmare Gacy left behind had infected someone else who was quietly waiting to take it further. To his friends, Gecht was charismatic, confident, mysterious, almost magnetic. But behind that charm hid a mind consumed by dark obsessions. He had a fascination with pain, control, and the idea of spiritual power through violence. He began preaching to his closest friends, 3 younger men who worked with him in construction, Edward Spraitzer and brothers Andrew and Thomas Cockerales. Together, they formed something between a gang, a cult, and a family. What they believed, or claimed to believe, was that through acts of cruelty, they could gain power. The 4 men would spend their nights driving through Chicago's neighborhoods, looking for women, mostly those alone or vulnerable. The crimes that followed were so brutal that for decades, many people refused to even speak of them. For this retelling, the details will remain respectful, because what matters more than the horror itself is what it revealed about human darkness and control. Between 1981 and 1982, a series of women went missing around Chicago. Some were last seen leaving their workplaces, others simply vanished on their way home. Weeks later, their bodies would be discovered, showing evidence of terrible violence. What confused investigators was the ritualistic nature of the crimes. They weren't random acts of anger or passion. They were systematic, planned, almost ceremonial. The city grew fearful. It was the same kind of fear that Chicago had felt during the Gacy years, a sense that something unspeakable was moving among them again, unseen and uncatchable. Police initially had no suspects, no leads, and no motive that made sense. The victims didn't seem connected, and the killers seemed to leave no trace. But what tied it all together was the pattern. Women disappearing near certain routes at similar times, always found far from where they vanished. As months passed, whispers spread through Chicago. Some people said it was a satanic cult. Others thought it was a lone serial killer copying Gacy. What no one expected was that this terror wasn't coming from a single monster, but a group of 4 ordinary men. Investigators finally caught a break in the fall of 1982 when a young woman named Beverly Washington was found alive. She had been attacked and left for dead, but somehow she survived. When police found her, she was barely conscious but alive enough to describe her attackers. Her account was crucial. She spoke of a van, red and old, and of men who claimed to be helping her until everything went black. Detectives immediately began searching for the vehicle she described, and within days, they found one matching the description. It was owned by Edward Spraitzer, one of Geck's workers. When questioned, Spraitzer cracked. He confessed not only to his own involvement but to the existence of the others, the Cacorales brothers and Geck himself. What he described sounded like something out of a nightmare. A group dynamic ruled entirely by Geck's will, a man who manipulated his followers through fear, loyalty, and twisted ideology. Spraitzer told investigators that Geck believed he was serving a higher purpose, something spiritual and powerful, and that his followers obeyed without question. When police arrested the others, the picture grew clearer. Each man had played a role, but Geck was the leader, the one who planned, controlled, and justified the horror. His home became a key point of investigation. Inside, detectives discovered a small room in the attic, draped in red light and lined with strange objects. It looked like a place of worship, though no religion on earth would claim it. To those who entered, it felt like stepping into the mind of a man who had long since abandoned any sense of morality. But even with all the confessions and physical evidence, one thing remained frustratingly unclear. Why? Why would 4 men, working class, intelligent, seemingly normal, commit crimes so extreme? Psychologists studying the case later described Geck as a dominant sadist and a cult manipulator. He didn't just control their actions, he shaped their beliefs. He convinced them that violence was not only acceptable but sacred, that by inflicting suffering, they were tapping into something greater than themselves. In his warped worldview, he wasn't a criminal, he was a prophet. The trial that followed in 1983 drew national attention. The courtroom was filled with tension, disbelief, and anger. Each of the crew members faced charges that could put them away for life, and each tried in their own way to shift blame onto the others. Geck denied everything, smiling calmly as witnesses testified against him. Spraitzer and the Cacorales brothers provided gruesome confessions, later recanted, but detailed enough to horrify the jury. The evidence was overwhelming. When the verdicts were announced, justice finally began to settle over the city. Edward Spraitzer and Andrew Cacorales were sentenced to death. Thomas Cacorales received a life sentence, and Geck, the supposed leader, was sentenced to prison for aggravated assault and attempted murder, as the most direct evidence against him in the murder cases was circumstantial. It felt unjust to many. The man believed to be the ringleader would live, while others faced execution. But the legal system could only act on what could be proven. The aftermath of the case left Chicago shaken. For years, people avoided discussing it, as though speaking the name Ripper Crew might invite the evil back. True crime experts have called it one of the most disturbing group murder cases in American history, not just for the violence, but for the psychology behind it. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about hatred. It was about power, control, and belief, a warped faith built on pain. The most haunting part of this story is that Robin Geck never confessed. Even decades later, he maintains his innocence, despite the overwhelming accounts against him. He has never expressed remorse, never acknowledged the victims, never explained his motives. To this day, he sits in prison, an enigma of cruelty and charisma, a man who convinced others to follow him into the darkest corners of the human soul. In 2019, one of the members, Thomas Cacorales, was released from prison after serving over 30 years. His release reignited anger and fear in Chicago. For the families of the victims, the pain was fresh again. Reporters gathered outside his halfway house, cameras flashing as people shouted for justice. But the law had spoken. Time had passed. And once again, Chicago was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always die. Sometimes, it just waits quietly for us to remember. Looking back, the Chicago Ripper crew remains one of the most terrifying examples of how human beings can twist faith, friendship, and loyalty into instruments of destruction. It's a story not just of murder, but of manipulation, of how one man's darkness can infect others, spreading like a disease until morality itself disappears. The horror of this case isn't in the blood or the violence. It's in the psychology. Four men, each capable of good, choosing evil, each losing themselves to a belief that pain could grant them purpose, each a reminder that monsters are not born in the shadows. They are made there, piece by piece, through influence, fear, and blind devotion. In the end, the Chicago Ripper crew's legacy is not only one of terror, but of warning. It shows how fragile the human conscience can be, how quickly it can crumble under the weight of persuasion and power. Behind every headline, every courtroom photo, and every survivor's tear lies the same chilling truth. Sometimes, evil doesn't look like a monster at all. Sometimes it looks like your coworker, your neighbor, the man fixing your roof. And that is what makes the Chicago Ripper crew so unforgettable. Not the crimes themselves, but the reality that they were never ghosts or myths, but men. Ordinary men who stepped willingly into extraordinary darkness, and in doing so, showed us how thin the line truly is between sanity and the abyss. The Servant Girl Annihilator. In the quiet heart of Texas during the 1880s, long before the bright lights and booming skyline, Austin was a small, growing town, a place of hope, music, and southern charm. But in the stillness of its warm summer nights, something dark was waiting. Between 1884 and 1885, a shadow stalked the dirt roads and alleyways, a figure history would later call the Servant Girl Annihilator. The name itself sounds like something from a Gothic novel, but the fear that gripped Austin was painfully real. Before Jack the Ripper haunted London, before serial killer was even a phrase, this unknown man brought terror to the streets of America's frontier city. It began quietly, almost unnoticed. Austin was growing and crime was not uncommon. But then one night in December 1884, a woman was attacked in her own home by an unseen intruder. The brutality shocked the town, but few imagined it was the beginning of something far worse. Over the next year, the same pattern would repeat again and again. Women, mostly young African-American servants, were attacked in the dead of night. Their homes were broken into while their families slept, and the women were dragged away into the darkness. There were no witnesses, no sounds except a faint scuffle, a scream quickly silenced, and then nothing. By morning, the horror was discovered, and Austin would wake to another nightmare. The newspapers struggled for words. The crimes were unlike anything the city or the country had ever seen. At the time, people didn't have a term for a person who killed again and again for pleasure or compulsion. The idea of a serial killer didn't yet exist in American vocabulary, but the citizens of Austin were seeing it firsthand, and they didn't know how to explain it. As the months passed, the attacks continued, each one more brazen than the last. Fear seeped into every corner of the city. People stopped going out after dark. Families began sleeping with weapons beside their beds. Doors were bolted, windows nailed shut. Servants refused to work alone, and whispers of the midnight assassin spread through the community. The victims were mostly servant women, hence the chilling nickname Servant Girl Annihilator, coined years later by an Austin journalist. But soon, the killer's rage turned even darker. He began targeting women from the upper class, breaking into well-kept homes and vanishing into the night like a phantom. Each attack followed a similar pattern, and yet no one ever saw the killer clearly. Witnesses reported a tall figure, perhaps wearing dark clothes, moving quickly and silently. Some said he was barefoot. Others swore they saw two shadows, suggesting there might have been more than one attacker. But despite police patrols, despite citizens forming night watches, the killer always escaped, disappearing as if swallowed by the darkness itself. The police, unprepared for crimes of this nature, arrested dozens of suspects. Husbands, boyfriends, vagrants, anyone who seemed suspicious. But there was no proof, no pattern they could grasp. The killing seemed to defy logic. The most terrifying thing was how random it all seemed. The killer had no clear motive. There was no robbery, no blackmail, no connection between victims that anyone could find. It was as if he killed for the act itself, something so unthinkable at the time that even detectives refused to consider it. As the terror continued into 1885, Austin's reputation began to crumble. Newspapers across Texas called it the Year of the Annihilator. Even the governor offered a reward, desperate to restore calm. Detectives were brought in from other states, but none could stop the nightmare. Then in December 1885, two women, both well known in the community, were killed on the same night. The attacks happened almost simultaneously on opposite sides of town. The scale of it sent Austin into chaos. Some claimed there must have been more than one killer. Others believed it was the same man, moving faster and more fearlessly than ever. After that night, the murders suddenly stopped. Just as abruptly as they had begun, the phantom vanished. No one was ever caught. No solid suspect was ever named. The police arrested several men, but each was released for lack of evidence. The attacks simply ended, leaving behind a city full of unanswered questions. And then something strange happened across the ocean. In 1888, just 3 years later, London would fall under the shadow of a new killer, Jack the Ripper. The similarities between the two cases have fueled speculation for over a century. Both targeted women, both attacked at night, both seemed to vanish without a trace. Some historians have even suggested that the servant girl annihilator might have traveled overseas, continuing his crimes under a new name. It's a theory that can never be proven, but it adds a haunting layer to the story. Could the world's most famous serial killer have first tested his cruelty in Austin, Texas? Even today, the question lingers. For modern criminologists, the servant girl annihilator represents a grim turning point in American history, the birth of an idea we now understand all too well, the mind of a serial predator. He showed no remorse, no connection to his victims, and no clear motive. He simply hunted. The impact on Austin was profound. The city changed after 1885. The sense of small-town safety was gone. Locks became stronger, streets better lit. People began demanding better policing, more organized investigations, and criminal profiling, ideas that would later shape modern forensic science. But beneath all that progress, the mystery remained unsolved. To this day, no one knows who the killer really was. Some say he was a laborer who left town when the panic grew too loud. Others believe he was someone within Austin's upper class, wealthy enough to hide in plain sight. A few even think the killer may have died soon after his last attack, taking his dark secrets with him. What makes the servant girl annihilator so haunting isn't just the brutality. It's the silence that followed. In a time before fingerprints, before criminal databases, before anyone could imagine one man committing a string of senseless murders, Austin was left to make sense of the impossible. The servant girl annihilator became a ghost story, a legend whispered through generations. Some historians call him America's first serial killer. Others call him the forgotten shadow of Jack the Ripper. Either way, his crimes marked the beginning of something new and terrifying in human history, a realization that monsters can walk among us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the cover of night. And perhaps that's the most chilling part. Not that he vanished, but that he might have never stopped. Because in every city, every era, there are those who disappear without reason. Every time a case remains unsolved, every time a shadow moves just out of sight, people wonder if the phantom of Austin ever truly went away, or if he simply changed his name. The Axeman of New Orleans. New Orleans, a city of rhythm, mystery, and restless spirits. By 1918, it pulsed with life, the scent of Creole cooking in the air, jazz spilling from open windows, and a heartbeat that never seemed to stop. But beneath the music and the laughter, something darker was moving through the night. They called him the Axeman of New Orleans. He didn't creep in alleys or strike in hidden corners. He came straight into people's homes, silent, unseen, unstoppable. His weapon was always the same, an axe. But what made him unforgettable wasn't just the crimes themselves. It was the fear, the legend, and the letter that would make him one of the most mysterious figures in American crime. It began in May 1918. The city was humid, restless, alive. When the first attack was discovered, it looked like a burglary gone wrong. A shop owner and his wife had been attacked in their own bed. The weapon, their own axe, had been left behind, slick and heavy with intent. The police searched for motives, robbery, revenge, jealousy. But money was still in the drawers. Jewelry remained untouched. There was no sign of who had done it or why. The people of New Orleans wanted to believe it was a one-time horror. But the city would soon learn. The Axeman was not finished. Over the next year, the attacks continued, each one following a pattern too strange to ignore. The victims were usually grocers or their families, often of Italian descent, living in the quieter neighborhoods of the city. The killer would break into their homes by chiseling out a panel in the back door, just enough space to reach in and unlatch it. The weapon, almost always an axe belonging to the household itself. He didn't steal, he didn't speak, he simply vanished into the night. Police flooded the streets. Neighbors began sleeping in shifts, guarding their homes with guns and clubs. The fear spread faster than the summer heat. Every creak of wood, every stray shadow, every barking dog sent hearts racing. Newspapers printed theories daily, each one more sensational than the last. Some said it was a madman. Others whispered it was something supernatural, a demon haunting New Orleans. But the Axeman wasn't done. He had something to say. In March 1919, the Times-Picayune newspaper received a letter, written in a tone both mocking and theatrical. It was signed the Axeman. The letter read like something from a Gothic tale, describing himself as a spirit, a demon from hell who could not be caught, who loved the sound of jazz. The most chilling part came near the end. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is playing on the night I am due to visit. It was a taunt and a challenge. The city erupted. On the night the Axeman mentioned, March 19, 1919, New Orleans came alive like never before. Every home, every bar, every street corner was filled with the sound of music. Jazz poured from the city like a heartbeat. People danced not for joy, but for survival. They played horns and drums through the night, terrified that silence might invite something unspeakable through their doors. And that night, no one died. The legend of the Axeman exploded. He became more than a criminal, he became a ghost story. The newspapers treated him like a myth, an unstoppable phantom that could strike anywhere, anytime. The fear turned into obsession. But while the letter gave him an almost supernatural reputation, the truth was far more human and far more terrifying because of it. The attacks continued in waves. Victims from all backgrounds were targeted. Sometimes whole families were left devastated. And yet, the killer always escaped. Detectives followed every lead. One suspect, a man named Joseph Momfer, was rumored to be behind the crimes, but the evidence was thin, built mostly on whispers and superstition. When Momfer himself was later shot dead by the widow of one of the Axeman's victims, the murders stopped, at least officially. Some believed justice had been served. Others thought the real killer had simply moved on. What made the Axeman's case so haunting wasn't just his violence, it was the atmosphere of it all. A city known for its love of music, food, and celebration had been forced into a symphony of fear. The people of New Orleans had faced hurricanes, fires, and epidemics before, but this was different. You couldn't rebuild after something like this. You couldn't hide from it. Even today, more than a century later, historians can't agree on who the Axeman was. Some say he was a local laborer with a hatred for Italian immigrants. Others believe there were multiple attackers whose crimes became merged into one myth. A few even think the letter wasn't written by the killer at all, but by a journalist hungry for headlines. But whoever he was, the Axeman's presence transformed New Orleans forever. In the years that followed, jazz became more than just music. It became a symbol, a reminder of the night the entire city played to keep death away. That one haunting evening when people turned terror into rhythm, when the sound of trumpets and drums drowned out fear itself. If you walk through New Orleans today, you can still feel it. The city has changed, rebuilt, grown, but the energy remains the same. The narrow streets, the gas lamps, the balconies that creak in the wind, they all whisper of the old days. And sometimes, when a jazz band plays late into the night, people joke that it's to keep the Axeman at bay. Because even though his crimes ended over 100 years ago, his legend never truly died. The idea that someone, anyone, could slip through locked doors, strike without warning, and then vanish without a trace, it's a story that doesn't fade. The Axeman wasn't just a killer. He was a mirror showing the world how fear spreads, how myth grows from mystery, and how even horror can be transformed into art. His letter, his threat, and the city's defiance turned a nightmare into folklore. And that's what makes the story of the Axeman so haunting. He didn't just kill people. He left behind an emotion, something intangible that lingers in the air long after the facts are gone. In the end, the Axeman of New Orleans remains one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries, a figure caught between reality and legend. A man who turned a city into a stage and fear into a melody. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most terrifying thing about him, that the music still plays, and the shadows still move when the night grows quiet.